Now, one thing I do want you to be aware of are the different actions that a president can take when a bill does come to his desk. First obvious one is the bill comes to his desk and he likes it. It's like that stimulus recovery package because of COVID-19. He'll have a signing ceremony and he'll sign that bill into law. That is a signing ceremony. He can simply sign it. In some cases, when he signs a bill into law, he'll even have what's called a signing statement. And in a signing statement, it's a part of the bill that he's saying, well, even though this is in the bill, I'm not going to enforce it because I deem it to be unconstitutional. That's something that President Bush used quite frequently when he signed bills into law. He used signing statements. So that's one thing he can do. He can sign a bill into law. Secondly, he can veto legislation, then he sends it back to Congress with his veto message explaining why he vetoed the bill. A third thing he can do is he can do nothing. And after 10 days after it's been presented to him, it automatically becomes law. And then finally, if Congress gives the president a bill and within 10 days of giving him that bill, they adjourn for the year, usually around Thanksgiving or December time. Well, if they give him that bill and then adjourn within 10 days, then if the president decides to do nothing to that bill, that's a special kind of veto called a pocket veto. But that only happens at the end of a congressional session. Now, I will tell you that when the president does use the power of veto or even pocket veto, that bill has basically died. Only about 7% of bills that get vetoed are ever overridden. And if you look at the limitation side of these notes, only about 7% of bills have been overridden by Congress. And that requires a 2/3 vote in both chambers, which is very difficult to have to take place, especially in today's party polarization that exists. You saw this even with the impeachment process, in which parties and the members have been sticking together, and rarely would you see Congress override a veto with a 2/3 vote. All right, so that's power and a limitation placed on the president in his ability to influence Congress as the chief legislator. All right, number 2 is the president can outline legislative proposals, and there's 2 speeches he gives in which he outlines his legislative proposals. One is called the inaugural address. That's what he does after he gets inaugurated, in which he identifies his proposals that he'd like Congress to pass during his administration. And then secondly, the president gives State of the Union addresses. These are speeches that he makes every year, in which he also identifies certain policies he'd like Congress to address. Finally, another power given to the president is his ability to call special sessions of Congress. It's only been used a few times since 1933 because Congress often is in session, so it's really not necessary to call a special session of Congress. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt used it to try to get Congress to pass some domestic measures for wage and hours laws in 1937. But this is something that's rarely used, mainly because Congress is in session a lot longer than it used to be before 1933. See, before 1933, Congress convened in April. Now Congress convenes in January and usually doesn't adjourn until December. All right, so you can see the powers given to the president, chief legislator, and limitations placed on the president. Now, if you go on to the next slides, you will see the number of vetoes that have been used by the president and how often they get overridden, which is very rare. And I also have some figures identifying Trump trying to convince Congress to pass a lot of his legislation. When he had a unified government, when you have his own party also controlling Congress, you would expect that a president would be able to get a lot of his legislation passed by Congress and proposals that he wants to get passed by Congress. And that's what that bar graph represents a couple slides on down. Usually in the first 2 years during the honeymoon period, the president can get a lot of legislation passed. And then usually when there's some criticism of the president's administration, how he's handled certain policies, you might also get time periods of what we call divided government, in which the opposing party will take over one of the chambers of Congress. And then obviously when you have a divided government, it's a lot more difficult for the president to get his policies passed. And if you look at Clinton, Bush, and Obama, all those presidents had unified governments in the first 2 years, but then they faced divided governments in the last 6 years of their presidencies. And you can see the decline in policies that they were able to get passed. Now, as head of political party, the president relies on his party to help him get elected and to support and endorse his campaign. So in turn, since members of the party helped him get elected, they would then expect that the president is going to appoint them to positions of power in the executive branch. Well, the ability to appoint people to federal jobs is called political patronage. And the expectation is the president will appoint people from his own party to take up cabinet positions, members of his White House staff, foreign advisor, domestic advisor positions as well. Many of these positions require confirmation by the Senate, but most of the White House positions, press secretary, chief of staff, those do not require Senate confirmation, and he's allowed to appoint whoever he wants. Now, one thing that we know about President Donald Trump is that he wants to ensure that people that he appoints are people that are going to be most loyal to him above anything else. And we've seen this especially after the impeachment trial, in which he had fired a lot of people he considered to be disloyal and has replaced them with people he considers to be more loyal to him. The European Union ambassador, Sondland, who testified against him in the impeachment trial, was fired as the ambassador to the EU, and he's a good example of being replaced by someone that would be much more loyal to do what Trump wanted to do. Now, I have a picture of Trump appointing Kushner, his son-in-law, to become one of his advisors. And even more recently, with the COVID-19 outbreak, he's been responsible for managing the stockpile, and the national stockpile that exists has been actually criticized, one, because he doesn't really have any experience in this area, and number two, how he's characterized what the purpose of the stockpile is supposed to be. There's more information on that if you want to look up news reports on Kushner and his dealing of the national stockpile. All right, but my point is, for Trump, he appoints people to federal jobs, and he's been criticized for even appointing family members to be people in his office. Well, that is the power of patronage. This is considered the role of head of political party because typically people he will appoint were people that are most loyal to him. And who is most loyal to him are going to be people from his own party. Now, there are limitations. This is where it gets a little tricky, so see if you can pay attention to this on limitations. First thing I have here is the party structure is fragmented. You might have Republicans in the South that love and are endearment of President Trump and support him no matter what he does. However, you're going to have maybe some Republicans on the West Coast or even Northeast that have a different view of President Trump and maybe aren't as in support of a lot of his policies. Now, I'll give you one example of a president who actually criticized a nominee that was running for governor of Louisiana. His name was David Duke. He was a Republican nominee trying to become the Republican candidate for governor in the state of Louisiana in 1991. Bush Sr., he denounced that nomination, saying, come on, Republicans, you don't want to vote for this guy, you don't want to support this guy, because he was a former Grand Wizard of the KKK, which would not make the Republican Party look very good. Well, regardless, Louisiana went ahead and nominated him anyway as a Republican candidate for governor. Fortunately, he lost to a Democrat named Edwards, but it's proof of the fact that even though the president's supposed to be a leader of his own political party, sometimes even people in other states, members of his own party, will ignore some of his recommendations. Interestingly, I always like to say that David Duke story because when Trump was running for election in 2016, David Duke came out and basically supported and endorsed Donald Trump running for election in 2016. And it took Trump a week before he actually renounced that endorsement. He didn't come out publicly to renounce it until a week later. Anyway, so my point is it's hard for the president to be the leader of the national party because people from West Coast that are Republicans are probably going to be different from Republicans in the South. Similarly, Democrats in the South are going to be different from Democrats in the coast, West Coast and East Coast. And then finally, another limitation is the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment limits the president to only 2 terms. So at the end of his second term, he's not going to have as much influence as he normally would because everybody in his party knows he's about to leave. As things began to change after the Great Depression, and we're seeing even to today, it became a necessity that the president serve as the chief economist, tried to instill confidence in the economy. In fact, in President FDR's one of his addresses, he noted, "You have nothing to fear but fear itself. trying to instill confidence in the banking system during the Great Depression. So when he made that statement, he was definitely serving in what we call the role of chief economist, trying to instill confidence back in the bank, into the banking system, and to instill confidence into the economy. Now, what has happened to the presidents in the last few decades, from the 20th century and beyond, is the fact that when the economy does well, people tend to give credit to the president. And when the economy does poorly, people tend to blame the president. I would argue this is one of the concerns that current President Donald Trump has, because he's fearful that if the economy takes a downturn, as it has, and continues through the election time in November, people will blame him. One of the things I think is noticeable is he's trying to put more responsibility on state governors, and I am anticipating that he's doing this so he can maybe push some of the blame on the economic crisis on some of these governors if the economy continues to go in a downward spiral. Anyway, Donald Trump has been touting the fact the economy was doing well throughout his presidency, and he was hoping this would be a major boon, a major boost for his efforts to win re-election in November. And with this current pandemic, clearly he's concerned about how the economy is going to be affected. So when the economy does well, people tend to give credit to the president, and that is exemplified by the fact that presidents usually will win re-election if the economy is doing well during their re-election. When the economy does poorly, people tend to blame the president, and that's exemplified if you look in if you look at 1992 when George Bush Sr. was running for re-election. The economy had taken a downturn, and many people had blamed him for the problems of the economy. In fact, one of President Clinton's main slogans during his election campaign was, "It's the economy, stupid." In other words, we need to focus on improving the economy, and that's what I will do if I become president. So as you can see, people give a lot of blame or credit to the president over the state of the economy. Now, what can the president use to try to influence the economy? Well, I have the OMB. That's the Office of Management and Budget. This is the agency that's responsible for preparing the budget on behalf of the president. They are supposed to be loyal to the president, and they're supposed to identify his priority. His proposals are supposed to be their priority. So whatever policies he wants to pursue and spends money on certain agencies or spend less money on certain agencies, that's supposed to be the policies that the OMB will support, and funding more for those policies. Now, to counter the weight of the president and his ability to influence the budget, even though Congress is supposed to begin the budget process with, I shouldn't say begin the budget process, because the budget process actually begins with the president and his proposal, though they're supposed to be responsible, Congress is, for the appropriations of funding of the national government. Well, to counter the proposals of the OMB, Congress created the Congressional Budget Office, also known as the CBO, and of course they are loyal to Congress. So when the president proposes a budget, it's the OMB that prepares that budget. They transfer it over to Congress so they can look at that proposal. It used to be that the Congress would have to rely on the facts and figures given to them by the OMB. Well, now that you have the CBO now can use their own facts and figures to determine what should be the priorities for funding levels for the next year. You can see this conflict that can take place between these two agencies when you look over the debate about the military funding that took place for Ukraine. The OMB basically said that they lawfully had restricted funds that were supposed to be sent to Ukraine to help them with military assistance against the Russians. The Congressional Budget Office said the way that money was suspended, even though it was suspended temporarily, was illegal in violation of a law that was covered previously, the Congressional Budget Impoundment Act. They argued that it was actually illegal for the president to restrict funding that was already approved and allocated by Congress without informing Congress within the appropriate time frame.